The autumn of 1941. German troops, like a steel avalanche, rolled across the territory of the Soviet Union. The blitzkrieg, lightning war, seemed to live up to its name. Kiev had fallen, Leningrad was encircled by a blockade, German tanks were rushing towards Moscow. In the southern direction, Hitler's gaze was fixed on the riches of Donbass, the industrial heart of the USSR. This region provided the country with 60% of its coal, 70% of its pig iron, and 60% of its steel.
The Donbass,
the capture of Donbass would not simply mean territorial acquisition. It would be a mortal blow to the military-industrial potential of the Soviet Union. For the Wehrmacht, the road to the Caucasus with its oil fields would open up, a resource without which the German war machine could not exist. The Soviet command perfectly understood the strategic importance of the region. Amidst the catastrophic defeats of the first months of the war, Donbass became a line that could not be surrendered without a fight. Here, on this scorched earth, the fate of not only the southern flank of the Soviet-German front, but perhaps the outcome of the entire war was being decided. Donbass, the treasure trove of the Soviet Union. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, this region had transformed into the most powerful industrial center, ensuring the country's defensive might. The numbers speak for themselves. 38% of all coal in the USSR, 44% of pig iron, 35% of steel, and 30% of rolled metal. All this was provided by Donbass. The largest metallurgical plants, machine-building factories, and chemical enterprises were located here. The region ensured the production of tanks, aircraft, artillery, everything that was vitally necessary for waging modern war. The German command was well aware of Donbass's economic value. Führer's Directive Number 34, dated July 30, 1941, explicitly stated Hitler's strategists planned not just to capture, but also to quickly restore the region's industry for the needs of the Third Reich. Of particular value were the coal mines and metallurgical plants, which were to become the raw material base for the German war industry. As part of Operation Barbarossa, the capture of Donbass was one of the key objectives of Army Group South. After the capture of Kiev and the forcing of the Dnieper, tank divisions under the command of General Colonel Kleist were to seize the Donets Basin with a swift thrust, and then launch an offensive on Rostov and further to the oil fields of the Caucasus. According to the German command's plan, the operation was to take no more than 2 to 3 weeks. The Soviet leadership understood the strategic importance of Donbass no less clearly. The loss of the region would mean a catastrophic reduction in the production of armaments and ammunition. After the heavy defeats of the summer of 1941 and the loss of a significant part of the western industrial regions, Donbass acquired even greater importance. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command set the Southern Front the task to hold Donbass at all costs. At the same time, an unprecedented evacuation of industrial enterprises began. Factories were dismantled and transported to the Urals and Siberia, literally from under the nose of the advancing enemy. This was a real industrial battle, no less important than the battles on the front line. Workers toiled around the clock, disassembling machine tools and equipment under German bombs. Railway workers performed miracles, forming echelons with equipment and sending them eastward. Many enterprises continued to produce goods for the front until the last opportunity, even when German tanks were already on the outskirts of cities. Thus, Donbass became an arena of dual confrontation, military and economic. For Hitler, its capture meant not only territorial acquisition, but also the undermining of the USSR's military-industrial potential. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Donbass became a matter of survival, an opportunity to win precious time to move industry to the rear and organize new defensive lines. By the autumn of 1941, the balance of power in the Donbass direction was not in favor of the Red Army. After the catastrophic defeat of Soviet troops in the Kiev Cauldron, where the main forces of the Southwestern Front were routed, the path to Donbass for German troops was practically open. Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group represented a powerful armored fist aimed at the industrial heart of the Soviet Union. It included 3 Panzer Corps, totaling 7 Panzer and 3 motorized divisions. Elite Wehrmacht formations, hardened in battle and with extensive experience in the blitzkrieg in Europe. Kleist's Panzer Group had about 600 combat vehicles, mainly medium PZ-3 and PZ-4 tanks. Air support was provided by the 4th Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe, which had absolute air superiority. In addition to Kleist's Panzer Group, the 17th Army of General Stulpnagel and parts of the 6th Army of General Reichenau were operating in the Donbass direction. The total strength of the German grouping aimed at Donbass was about 350,000 soldiers and officers. The troops were well equipped with artillery, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. The morale of German soldiers remained high. Behind them were victories in Poland, France, and the Western Soviet Union. They believed in a quick end to the war and their invincibility. The Soviet troops were opposed by a formidable force, a well-oiled military machine operating according to a clear plan. The Southern Front, which was to defend Donbass, was in a critical situation. After the defeats of the summer-autumn of 1941, its formations were severely weakened. The front included the 9th, 12th, 18th, and 37th Armies. The total number of troops was about 200,000 people, almost half that of the enemy. The shortage of tanks was particularly acute. Only about 150 combat vehicles, mostly outdated designs. Artillery also lagged behind the German in both quantity and quality. Air cover was minimal. German aviation firmly held air superiority. The command of the Southern Front realized the full gravity of the situation. Colonel General Yakov Cherevichenko, who headed the front in September 1941, made desperate efforts to organize the defense. Fortified areas were hastily created, roads were mined, and anti-tank lines were formed. However, there was a catastrophic lack of time. Great hopes were placed on the People's Militia. Volunteer battalions were formed in the mining towns of Donbass. Workers from Makiivka, Horlivka, Stalino, and Voroshilovgrad took up arms, preparing to defend their hometowns. Many of them had only minimal military training, but their determination to fight to the death compensated for the lack of experience. NKVD fighter battalions and border guard units were also involved in the defense. A peculiarity of the Soviet troops was their heterogeneity and varying levels of training. Along with experienced units that had gone through the crucible of battles, the armies included hastily formed units of conscripts and militiamen. Technical equipment was also uneven. While some divisions had a relatively complete set of weapons, others experienced an acute shortage even of small arms. Nevertheless, the Soviet command sought to use all available advantages. The main one was knowledge of the terrain. The hilly terrain of Donbass, with numerous ravines, gullies, mines, and spoil heaps, represented a natural fortress. With proper organization of defense, these landscape features could significantly slow down the advance of German tank columns. The second advantage was the support of the local population. Residents of Donbass helped the troops in creating defensive structures, becoming guides, scouts, and liaison officers. Despite the overwhelming superiority of the enemy, Soviet troops were preparing to give a decisive rebuff. Every day won was worth its weight in gold. It provided an opportunity to evacuate industrial enterprises, bring up reserves, and strengthen defensive lines. Fighters and commanders understood that there was nowhere further to retreat. Behind them were not just cities and villages, but the industrial heart of the country. The 7th of October, 1941, became the day the German hammer struck the Donbass. Following a regrouping of forces and replenishment of fuel and ammunition, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group launched a decisive offensive. The attack was delivered simultaneously along several axes, but the main thrust was aimed at Stalino, the administrative and industrial center of the region. The German command employed its favored tactic, honed in Poland and France: a powerful aerial strike on Soviet positions, followed by a swift breakthrough of tank formations and the subsequent encirclement of scattered enemy groups. The skies over the Donbass belonged to the Luftwaffe in those days. Waves of Junkers 87 and Heinkel 111 bombers delivered successive blows to artillery positions, command posts, and communication hubs. Messerschmitt 109 fighters systematically destroyed the few Soviet aircraft attempting to counter the aerial armada. The ground trembled from exploding bombs. Trenches and dugouts turned into mass graves. After the aerial preparation, the tanks went on the attack. German tactics were honed to perfection. Tank wedges, supported by motorized infantry, rapidly advanced, bypassing pockets of resistance and creating breaches in the Soviet defense. The main infantry forces followed, finishing off encircled groups of Soviet troops. The attack by General Eberhard von Mackensen's 3rd Panzer Corps in the direction of Krasnoarmysk and Konstantinovka proved particularly effective. By the end of the first day of the offensive, German tanks had advanced up to 30 kilometers deep, threatening to encircle a significant Groviet forces. The southern front found itself in a critical situation. Communication between units was disrupted, and troop command was hampered. General Cherevichenko attempted to organize counterattacks with reserve forces, but they were catastrophically few. Major General Karatonov's 9th Army, which bore the main brunt of the attack, struggled to contain the onslaught of superior enemy forces. Major General Lopatin's 37th Army desperately maneuvered. Trying to close gaps in the defense, the Soviet command improvised, throwing everything they had into battle, from understaffed rifle divisions to hastily formed militia detachments. In those days, anti-tank artillery units played a special role. The crews of the, quote, contemptuously called, quote, "one" by the Germans, displayed miracles of bravery. They rolled their guns out for direct fire and fired at German tanks until the last shell, often at the cost of their own lives. Particularly fierce battles unfolded in the vicinity of Artyomovsk and Gorlovka. Here, Soviet troops, utilizing the terrain's features, hills, ravines, mine dumps, managed to temporarily halt the advance of German tank columns. Mining settlements were transformed into fortified areas, each house becoming a strong point. The Germans suffered losses but methodically pressed forward, utilizing their superiority in firepower. On October 9th, German tanks reached the approaches to Stalino. The city prepared for defense. Barricades were erected in the streets, and firing points were set up in houses. Worker detachments, along with regular units, took up defensive positions around the city's perimeter. Simultaneously, the evacuation of industrial equipment continued. The last echelons departed under German bombs. What could not be evacuated was destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The Soviet command understood that holding Stalino in the current situation was impossible. But every day of delaying the enemy's advance was invaluable. In these critical days, both the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet defense became apparent. The strengths included the selflessness of the soldiers and commanders, their readiness to fight to the death. The weaknesses remained insufficient coordination between units. a shortage of communication equipment, and a lack of air cover. The German offensive developed successfully, but already in the first days of fighting for the Donbass, alarming symptoms for the Wehrmacht appeared. The pace of advance proved to be lower than planned. While on the first day of the offensive, German tanks advanced up to 30 kilometers, in the following days, this figure decreased to 15 to 20 kilometers. The resistance of Soviet troops proved to be more stubborn than anticipated. In addition, supply problems began to take their toll. Stretched communication lines hampered the timely delivery of fuel and ammunition. Voroshilovgrad met the German offensive with grim determination. By mid-October 1941, when the Wehrmacht's tank wedges broke through to the city, it had already turned into a true fortress. The command of the Southern Front understood the strategic importance of this industrial center. The loss of Voroshilovgrad opened the enemy's path deep into the Donbass and threatened to encircle a significant grouping of Soviet troops. The city's defense was led by Major General Anton Lopatin, commander of the 37th Army. At his disposal were units of the 238th and 353rd Rifle Divisions, battered in previous battles, separate artillery units, and a consolidated regiment of People's Militia, formed from workers of the locomotive building plant and other city enterprises. The fiercest battles unfolded on the western and northwestern approaches to Voroshilovgrad. Here, on the heights near the village of Alexandrovka, the soldiers of Colonel Ivan Kolnev's 353rd Rifle Division took up defense. The positions were well chosen. The hilly terrain hampered the maneuvering of German tanks, and deep ravines provided cover for Soviet infantry and artillery. On October 16th, the Germans made their first breakthrough attempt. After powerful artillery preparation and airstrikes, tanks of the Wehrmacht's 14th Panzer Division went on the attack. More than 50 combat vehicles, supported by motorized infantry, moved towards the positions of Soviet troops. A fierce battle ensued. The artillerymen of Captain Grigory Shilov's anti-tank battalion let the German tanks approach to direct fire range and opened fire. Sergeant Pyotr Bolotov's crew knocked out 3 tanks before being destroyed by a direct hit. Gun Commander Senior Sergeant Nikolai Kravtsov, left alone at the gun, continued firing until he ran out of all shells, and then blew himself up and a German tank that had broken through to the position with an anti-tank grenade. Despite the heroic resistance, by evening the Germans managed to wedge into the Soviet defenses. The situation was becoming critical. At this moment, the commander of the 353rd Division, Colonel Kolnev, made a risky decision: to launch a night counterattack with a reserve battalion and a company of T-34 tanks, which had recently arrived as reinforcements. At 2 in the morning, Soviet tanks with a landing party of submachine gunners attacked the German advanced detachment. The surprise of the strike brought success. The enemy was repulsed, losing several tanks and armored personnel carriers. This allowed the situation to be restored and precious time to be gained for strengthening the main line of defense. Simultaneously with the battles on the approaches to the city, a feverish evacuation of equipment from Voroshilovgrad factories was underway. Workers dismantled machine tools and mechanisms under continuous bombing. Railway workers formed echelons that departed eastward, one after another. Of particular value was the equipment of the locomotive building plant, the country's largest manufacturer of locomotives. Plant director Alexander Kazakov organized round-the-clock work to dismantle unique machines. What could not be removed was destroyed or rendered unusable. When German aviation bombed the railway tracks, workers carried parts of machines by hand to alternate tracks located several kilometers from the plant. The People's Militia played an important role in the city's defense. Miners, metallurgists, railway workers took up arms and stood alongside the Red Army soldiers. Many of them had experience in the Civil War, others had undergone military training in the Osoaviakim system. The commander of the Consolidated Militia Regiment was Stepan Rudenko, a former Red commander and now chief engineer of the metallurgical plant. The militiamen took up defense on the outskirts of the city, turning every house into a strong point. They built barricades, dug anti-tank ditches, and laid mines on probable enemy advance routes. Women and teenagers helped the wounded, put out fires after German bombings, and provided food to the soldiers. On October 18th, the Germans resumed their offensive, throwing fresh forces into battle. Now the strike was delivered from the southwest, where the defense was weaker. The battles took on an exceptionally fierce character. Soviet troops, inferior to the enemy in numbers and weaponry, compensated for this with perseverance and self-sacrifice. On October 20th, 1941, German tanks approached the outskirts of Stalino. The city, bearing the leader's name, was not merely an administrative center. It housed strategically important metallurgical plants, mines, and machine-building enterprises. The capture of Stalino opened the Wehrmacht's path deep into the Donetsk basin and created a threat of encirclement for significant forces of the Southern Front. The city's defense was entrusted to units of the 232nd Rifle Division under Colonel Ivan Taranov and a combined detachment of the People's Militia. The forces were unequal. Against the Soviet defenders, advanced units of the German 16th Panzer Division and the SS Motorized Division. The first battles unfolded on the western outskirts of the city. The Germans, employing their favored tactic, launched a powerful airstrike, then threw tanks into the attack, supported by motorized infantry. The Soviet defense cracked under the pressure of superior enemy forces, but did not break. Anti-tank crews, positioned in semi-destroyed buildings and behind barricades, played a crucial role. Lieutenant Mikhail Kravchenko's battery, located near the railway depot, knocked out 7 German tanks before being destroyed by a direct hit from an aerial bomb. Kravchenko himself, severely wounded, continued to direct fire until the last shell. Gradually, the battles shifted to the city streets. Every block, every house turned into a fortress. Miners and metallurgists of Stalino fought with incredible tenacity. They knew the terrain better than the enemy and exploited this advantage. Underground communications, adits of abandoned mines, became routes for sudden counterattacks and sabotage behind enemy lines. Particularly fierce battles erupted over the Stalin Metallurgical Combine, the heart of the city's industrial potential. The Germans sought to capture the enterprise undamaged to use its capacities for their needs. The Soviet command received the opposite order, to destroy everything that could not be evacuated. Workers of the Combine, under the leadership of Chief Engineer Vasily Demchenko, mined blast furnaces, rolling mills, and power plants. Simultaneously, the evacuation of the most valuable equipment continued. The last echelons departed literally from under the noses of the advancing German units. On October 21st, the enemy launched a decisive assault. After massive bombing, tanks and infantry went on the attack. Soviet troops were forced to retreat, fighting rearguard actions. By evening, the Germans captured the city center and reached the Kalmius River. The remaining defenders retreated to the eastern outskirts, where they tried to organize a new line of defense. At this critical moment, an event occurred that went down in the history of Stalino's defense. A group of minor militiamen, led by former Red partisan Ivan Zaitsev, using the underground workings of the Centralnaya mine, emerged behind a German tank column and attacked it with grenades and Molotov cocktails. 4 tanks were knocked out, and up to a platoon of enemy infantry was destroyed. This daring sortie delayed the German advance and allowed the evacuation of the wounded from the city hospital. On October 22nd, Stalino had to be abandoned. Soviet troops retreated eastward to new defense lines. But the city did not surrender without a fight. Every street, every house was drenched in the blood of its defenders. The Germans paid a high price for this industrial center. Before the retreat, the operation to destroy industrial facilities was completed. Explosions rocked metallurgical and coke chemical plants and machine-building enterprises. What could not be removed did not fall into enemy hands. Having captured Stalino, the German command expected to quickly restore its industrial potential for the needs of the Third Reich. However, instead of working factories, they received ruins and disabled equipment. The evacuated enterprises soon began operations in the Urals and Siberia, producing tanks, aircraft, and shells for the Red Army. When the Wehrmacht's tank columns rushed towards the heart of Donbass, a no less dramatic battle unfolded at railway stations, factory yards, and mine headframes. The battle for the country's industrial potential. The operation to evacuate Donbas enterprises was unprecedented in scale and timing. It was a true industrial epic, demanding colossal effort, engineering ingenuity, and the truly heroic labor of thousands of people. Already in July 1941, the State Defense Committee decided on the urgent evacuation of key industrial facilities from the western regions of the country. For Donbass, this task proved particularly challenging. It was necessary to dismantle and transport equipment from hundreds of enterprises, many of which were gigantic production complexes with thousands of units of machinery. The most valuable equipment was considered to be that of machine-building plants producing weapons and ammunition. The Kramatorsk Heavy Machine Tool Plant, the Starokramatorsk Machine Tool Plant, and the Novokramatorsk Machine Tool Plant. These giant enterprises had to be saved first. Unique machines and presses weighing hundreds of tons were dismantled around the clock. Workers toiled for 12 to 16 hours without days off. Engineer Mikhail Bondarenko, who led the evacuation of equipment from the Novokramatorsk plant, recalled, "We understood that every saved machine meant hundreds of shells and mines that would be fired at the enemy. People worked to the limit of human capabilities. When air raids began, many refused to go to shelters, continuing to dismantle equipment under bombs." The evacuation of metallurgical plants presented a particular difficulty. Blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills, equipment of colossal size and weight. It was impossible to fully evacuate such facilities, so only the most valuable and technologically complex units were dismantled. What could not be evacuated had to be destroyed, so that it would not fall into enemy hands. Chief engineer of the Makeyevka Metallurgical Combine, Alexei Kuznetsov, oversaw preparations for the explosion of Blast Furnace No. 3, the largest in Europe. "It was like killing your own child," he later said. "We built this blast furnace for 5 years, putting our soul into it, and now we had to destroy it. But we understood. Ruins are better than a combine working for Hitler." The evacuation of coal mines mainly involved the removal of hoisting mechanisms, pumping equipment, and electric motors. The rest had to be flooded, or the shafts blown up. Each such operation was a tragedy for the miners, many of whom had worked underground their entire lives. The logistics of the evacuation presented an equally complex challenge. The Donbass railway network operated at its limit. Trains with equipment were formed under constant bombing. Engine drivers and track workers performed true feats, restoring destroyed tracks and ensuring the movement of echelons. Ivan Shushkov, head of the North Donetsk Railway, organized special emergency repair brigades that followed every evacuation echelon. When German aviation bombed the railway bridge across the Seversky Donets River, Such a brigade restored the crossing in 18 hours of continuous work, allowing the last trains with equipment from the Lugansk locomotive plant to pass. Along with the equipment, engineering and technical personnel and skilled workers were evacuated. These people had to set up production in a new location in the shortest possible time. Often, families were separated. Men left with the factories, women and children were evacuated separately. The final destination for most Donbas enterprises was the Urals and Siberia. The Kramatorsk heavy machine tool plant was moved to Orsk, Novokramatorsk to Elektrostal, Starokramatorsk to Irkutsk. The Lugansk locomotive plant found a new home in Omsk. In their new locations, enterprises were often set up in the open air. Machines were installed directly on the ground, and temporary shelters were hastily erected over them. People worked in 30-degree frost, slept by the machines, but production was established in record time. Within 2 to 3 months, the evacuated factories began producing goods for the front. Not everything could be saved. According to various estimates, 50 to 70% of the industrial potential of Donbass was evacuated. The rest had to be destroyed or fell into enemy hands. But even this was a colossal achievement given the tight deadlines and extremely difficult evacuation conditions. When German troops entered the industrial centers of Donbass, they were met with the ruins of factories and flooded mines. Plans for the rapid restoration of industry for the needs of the Third Reich were thwarted, and the evacuated enterprises, reborn in the east of the country, began to work for victory. The evacuation of Donbas industry was a feat equal to that of the front line. It was a battle for machines and equipment, for the country's industrial potential, for future victory. A battle won by ordinary workers, engineers, and railwaymen in those harsh autumn days of 1941. The Wehrmacht's tank wedges became the hallmark of the blitzkrieg, the strategy of lightning warfare that allowed Germany to conquer most of Europe in a matter of weeks. In the battles for Donbass in the autumn of 1941, this tactic once again demonstrated its effectiveness, but at the same time exposed the first signs of its exhaustion on the Eastern Front. The essence of the tank wedge lay in the concentration of armored vehicles on a narrow sector of the front for a rapid breakthrough of the enemy's defenses. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, advancing on Donbass, had about 600 tanks organized into 3 tank corps. Each corps was a powerful udarny kulak, striking fist, capable of breaching any defense. The German offensive always began with massive aerial preparation. Stuka dive bombers, nicknamed, quote, Bast shoe wearers, by Soviet soldiers due to the characteristic sound of their sirens, rained down deadly cargo on resistance strongholds, artillery positions, and command posts. Heinkel 111s then appeared in the sky, finishing off surviving targets. Messerschmitt 109 fighters reliably covered the bombers and hunted Soviet aircraft. After the air preparation, the tanks entered the battle. They moved in a dense group, forming a wedge, the tip of which consisted of heavy PZ-4 tanks with long-barreled 75mm guns. These were followed by more numerous medium PZ-3 tanks, armed with 50mm cannons. The flanks were covered by light PZ-2 tanks and Czech PZ-38Ts. The most important element of the tactic was speed. Tank formations sought to penetrate deep into the enemy's defenses as quickly as possible, without getting involved in prolonged battles with isolated pockets of resistance. Their task was to create a breach through which the main forces of motorized infantry could pass. The tanks were supported by mobile units, motorcyclists, armored cars, and self-propelled guns. In Donbass, this tactic faced serious difficulties. The hilly terrain with numerous ravines, gullies, and spoil heaps limited the maneuverability of tank formations. Mining settlements with their sturdy stone buildings turned into fortified areas that had to be stormed, losing precious time and equipment. The Soviet command, taking into account the bitter experience of the first months of the war, began to adapt its tactics to counter tank wedges. The defense was built on the principle of anti-tank areas, strongholds saturated with artillery and anti-tank weapons. Anti-tank reserves, which were transferred to threatened directions, played a special role. In the battles near Artyomovsk and Gorlovka, Soviet artillerymen for the first time massively applied the tactic of dagger fire, when anti-tank guns were carefully camouflaged and opened fire only from close range, from the flanks at passing tank columns. This allowed for maximum effectiveness with minimal shell consumption. Gradually, the pace of the German offensive began to slow down. If in the first days of the operation tank formations advanced 20 to 30 kilometers a day, by mid-October, this figure dropped to 10 to 15 kilometers. This was due not only to the increased resistance of Soviet troops, but also to supply problems, stretched communications, and equipment wear and tear. One of the first signs of the stalling of the blitzkrieg was the increased tank losses. German tank divisions, which began the offensive with 80 to 100 vehicles, had no more than 50 to 60 in service by the end of October. Repair services could not cope with the flow of damaged equipment, and spare parts arrived intermittently. Another problem was crew fatigue. Tankers were under constant tension, sleeping 3 to 4 hours a day and eating irregularly. The commander of the 2nd Panzer Regiment of the 16th Panzer Division, Oberst Wilhelm Ritter, noted in his report, "The men are exhausted to the limit. Many fall asleep right at the controls. Urgent rotation of crews is required, otherwise combat capability will be completely lost." Weather conditions also began to work against the Germans. Autumn rains turned the dirt roads of Donbass into an impassable mess. Tanks got stuck in the mud, and fuel consumption sharply increased. The supply of ammunition and fuel became increasingly problematic. Despite all difficulties, the Wehrmacht's tank wedges continued to advance. By the end of October, most of Donbass was in enemy hands. However, the price of this success turned out to be unexpectedly high for the German command. Losses in personnel and equipment exceeded estimated figures by 2 to 3 times. The deadlines for the operation were missed. The offensive on Donbass became a turning point in the history of the blitzkrieg. For the first time, the German command faced a situation where the tactics of tank wedges, so effective in Poland and France, began to falter. The war took on a protracted character, for which the Wehrmacht was not prepared either materially or psychologically. Unlike the regular units of the Wehrmacht, Soviet troops in Donbass were forced to wage war in a completely different way, improvising on the go and relying on the selflessness of individual soldiers and commanders. This tactic was born out of desperation, but gradually transformed into an effective system of resistance against superior enemy forces. Battalion Commissar Semyon Golikov, finding himself cut off with a group of 80 fighters years near the Red October mine, organized a real partisan detachment. Using underground workings and knowledge of the terrain, his fighters carried out sudden sorties, attacked German communications, and destroyed ammunition depots. In 2 weeks, Golikov's detachment destroyed 7 tanks, over 20 vehicles, and about 100 enemy soldiers. A distinctive feature of the Soviet defense was the creation of improvised, fortified areas. When standard defensive lines were breached, local commanders formed strongholds from whatever was at hand. Individual buildings, mine dumps, railway embankments were turned into fortresses. Captain Nikolai Lutai, commander of an artillery battalion who had lost most of his guns in battle, created a fortified area on the outskirts of the village of Yenakievo from the remaining 2 45s and 3 heavy machine guns. Positioning the guns on the terraced slopes of the slag heap, he provided crossfire on all approaches. When a German tank column tried to pass through the village, it fell into a real fire trap. 8 tanks were knocked out, and the rest turned back. Soviet commanders learned on the fly, adapting tactics to real conditions. If at the beginning of the war, anti-tank guns were often deployed in open positions, where they became easy prey for German aviation and artillery, now they were carefully camouflaged and opened fire only at close range. Major Pyotr Savchenko, commander of an anti-tank battalion, developed the tactic of, quote, "His crews never stayed long in one place. After firing a few shots, they quickly changed position. This made it difficult for the enemy to suppress firing points and created the illusion of a much larger number of artillery." Miners played a special role in the defense of Donbass. People accustomed to working in extreme underground conditions showed exceptional resilience and resourcefulness in battle. They were perfectly oriented in the labyrinths of underground workings, using them for sudden attacks and clandestine movements. In the Horlivka area, a group of miners led by foreman Ivan Zotov organized a real underground fortress. Using abandoned adits, they created a system of shelters and communication passages inaccessible to German aviation and artillery. From here, sorties were made into the enemy's rear, and the wounded were brought here. The heroism of individual soldiers and commanders often decided the outcome of the battle. Junior Lieutenant Alexei Kononov, commander of an anti-tank rifle platoon, despite being wounded, single-handedly held the crossing over the Lugan River. In 6 hours of battle, he knocked out 3 German tanks and destroyed over 20 enemy soldiers. When his ammunition ran out, Kononov blew himself up and the Germans surrounding him with his last grenade. The Soviet command, despite the general retreat, sought to carry out counterattacks wherever possible. Even small tactical successes had enormous moral significance, showing the soldiers that the enemy was not invincible. Night counterattacks proved particularly effective. In the dark, the German advantage in aviation and artillery was minimized, and Soviet soldiers, who knew the terrain better, gained an advantage. Under the cover of night, infantry units with attached tanks launched sudden strikes on the flanks and rear of advancing German units. On the night of October 18th, Captain Grigory Shevchenko's battalion conducted a daring operation in the Debaltseve area. Stealthily approaching the German tank park, the soldiers pelted the equipment with grenades and Molotov cocktails. 14 tanks and armored personnel carriers and a fuel depot were destroyed. This raid delayed the enemy's offensive for 2 days. Gradually, a system began to emerge in the actions of Soviet troops. Retreating, they created echeloned defenses, mined roads, and set up ambushes. Every settlement, every height became a stronghold that had to be taken by force. The sky over Donbass in the autumn of 1941 became an arena of fierce confrontation, where the fate of not only ground operations, but the entire battle was decided. Air battles over the industrial region acquired a special character. Fierce, uncompromising, with the highest intensity of heroism from both sides. The balance of power in the air was extremely unfavorable for Soviet aviation. The 4th Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe, supporting the advance of Army Group South, numbered about 800 aircraft of various types. These were the newest Messerschmitt 109 fighters, Junkers 87 dive bombers, Heinkel 111 bombers. Against this armada, the Soviet command could field only about 250 machines, many of which were of outdated designs. I-16 and I-15 fighters, which formed the basis of Soviet fighter aviation at the beginning of the war, were significantly inferior to German Messerschmitts in speed and armament. Only a small number of new Yak-1 and Lag-3 could fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms. In such conditions, Soviet pilots compensated for technical backwardness with exceptional courage and skill. Captain Alexander Pokryshkin, who served at that time in the 55th Fighter Aviation Regiment, later recalled, "We understood that every downed German aircraft meant dozens of saved lives of our soldiers on the ground. Therefore, we went into battle even when the enemy's advantage was overwhelming." The tactics of Soviet pilots were constantly improving. If at the beginning of the war they acted according to outdated pre-war instructions, by the autumn of 1941 they began to use more flexible combat formations. Instead of dense, wedge, and echelon formations, they switched to pairs and flights, which provided better maneuverability and mutual support. Sudden attacks from behind clouds, from sun rays, using terrain folds for camouflage, proved particularly effective. One of the most effective Soviet aces in the battles over Donbass was Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Glinka. In 2 weeks of October, he shot down 7 German aircraft, including 3 bombers and 4 fighters. In the battle on October 17, his flight of 4 I-16s attacked a group of 12 Junkers under the cover of 6 Messerschmitts. Despite the enemy's threefold superiority, Soviet pilots managed to shoot down 3 bombers and 1 fighter without losing any of their own machines. This battle became a textbook example of how tactical skill can compensate for technical backwardness. Attack aviation played a key role in containing the German offensive. IL-2 aircraft, dubbed 3 by the Germans for their devastating firepower and high survivability, delivered pinpoint strikes against tank columns, concentrations of equipment, and artillery positions. The actions of attack aircraft were particularly effective in conditions of low cloud cover, when German fighters could not provide reliable cover for their ground troops. On October 21st, a group of 6 IL-2s under the command of Captain Nikolai Krasnov attacked a tank column of the 17th Tank Division of the Wehrmacht on the march near the village of Amvrosievka. As a result of the accurate strike, 11 tanks and about 20 vehicles with infantry and ammunition were destroyed. This delayed the division's advance for a day. Bomber aviation operated mainly at night, when the Luftwaffe's air superiority was not so absolute. Long-range DB-3 and SB bombers struck airfields, railway junctions, and troop concentrations in the enemy's near rear. Despite heavy losses, these operations significantly hampered the supply of advancing German units. By the end of October, the first signs of a decline in the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe began to appear in the air battles over Donbass. Stretched communications hampered the supply of spare parts and fuel to German air units. Intensive operation of aircraft in the conditions of the Eastern Front led to rapid wear and tear of equipment. German crews, continuously participating in combat sorties since June 1941, began to show signs of fatigue. The commander of the 3rd Group of the 27th Fighter Squadron of the Luftwaffe, Major Wolfgang Schellmann, noted in his report of October 25th, "The pilots are exhausted to the limit. Many are flying with colds. The technical condition of the machines is deteriorating every day. There is a shortage of spare parts, especially for engines. If the situation does not change, the combat effectiveness of the group will drop to a critical level within a month." By mid-October 1941, an atmosphere of restrained anxiety permeated the headquarters of Army Group South. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, leaning over a map of the Donbass region, meticulously studied reports from the front. The red flags, indicating the advance of German troops, moved forward, but significantly slower than initially planned. "Gentlemen," Von Rundstedt addressed the assembled officers. "We must admit that the pace of the offensive is unsatisfactory. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group has advanced only 70 kilometers in the last week. According to the plan, we should have already reached Rostov." Chief of Staff General Sodenstern threw up his hands. "My Führer, we have encountered unforeseen difficulties. Russian resistance is much more stubborn than we expected. Moreover, the weather conditions—" "I don't want to hear about the weather," the Field Marshal sharply interrupted him. "The weather is the same for both sides. The problem is deeper." This conversation reflected the growing realization among the German command that the blitzkrieg on the Eastern Front was beginning to falter. The Donbass operation, conceived as a swift dash to Rostov and then to the Caucasus, had turned into an exhausting battle for every settlement, for every height. The initial plan envisaged the capture of the entire Donetsk basin within 2 to 3 weeks. By the end of October, Rostov-on-Don was supposed to fall, opening the way to the oil fields of the Caucasus. However, reality proved different. The offensive developed more slowly, losses were higher, and the resistance of Soviet troops was fiercer than anticipated. Alarming reports from commanders of tank and motorized divisions arrived daily at the headquarters of Army Group South. General Ewald von Kleist, commander of the 1st Panzer Group, reported growing supply problems. Stretched communications, destroyed roads and railway lines hampered the delivery of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Panzer divisions, which began the offensive with 80 to 90% combat-ready vehicles, had no more than 60% of their equipment in service by the end of October. Losses in personnel caused particular concern. The commander of the 16th Panzer Division, Major General Hans Valentin Hube, wrote in his report of October 23, "Losses in officer personnel have reached a critical level. In some companies, sergeants are taking command. Replacements do not compensate for the losses. Morale remains high, but the physical exhaustion of the men is becoming increasingly noticeable." The German command was forced to adjust its plans. On October 25th, a significant change appeared in the directive of the High Command of the Army. The deadlines for reaching Rostov-on-Don were postponed by 2 weeks. This was the first official admission that the blitzkrieg was not keeping to the planned schedule. At the same time, tactical approaches also changed. If at the beginning of the campaign, tank wedges swiftly broke through, leaving pockets of resistance to the following echelons of infantry, now commanders were forced to act more cautiously. Every large settlement, every strong point, had to be taken by methodical assault, using artillery and aviation. In early November, Field Marshal von Rundstedt sent a memorandum to the High Command of the Army, in which he openly admitted for the first time the impossibility of completing the Eastern Campaign before winter. He wrote, "The enemy's resistance is not broken. Despite huge losses in men and equipment, the Russians continue to fight with desperate determination. We are opposed not only by the Red Army, but by the entire people. Every city, every village turns into a fortress. Under these conditions, to count on a quick end to the campaign would be unjustified optimism." This document became one of the first signals that the blitzkrieg strategy on the Eastern Front was failing. The war was taking on a protracted character, for which Germany was neither economically nor psychologically prepared. The Donbass operation also revealed other problems of the Wehrmacht. The German war machine, designed for short, intense campaigns, began to falter under prolonged strain. Tanks and vehicles designed for good European roads struggled with the impassable roads of the Donbass. Soldiers, equipped for a summer campaign, were unprepared for the autumn mud and approaching cold. Time is the most valuable resource in war. The Soviet command fully realized this simple truth during the defense of Donbass in the autumn of '41. Every day of delay in the German offensive turned into a week of work for evacuated factories in the Urals, into thousands of saved lives, into kilometers of fortified lines on new defensive positions. When Kleist's tank wedges got bogged down in the Donbass steppes, when their pace of advance slowed from 30 to 10 kilometers a day, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command perceived this as the first, albeit small, victory. A victory of time over the blitzkrieg. The deceleration of the German offensive had enormous strategic consequences. First of all, it allowed for the completion of an unprecedented evacuation of industrial enterprises. By the beginning of November '41, more than 60% of Donbass's production capacities had been dismantled and sent eastward. Echelons with equipment were already arriving in the Urals and Siberia, where the assembly of machines and units began on prepared sites. Vasily Ermolayev, chief engineer of the Kramatorsk machine-building plant, who oversaw the restoration of production in Orsk, recalled, "We gained 2 weeks' head start thanks to our soldiers in Donbass. Without this time, the installation of equipment would have taken not a month, but 6 months. And that means thousands of unmade shells, hundreds of unproduced tanks." No less important was the time gained for preparing new defensive lines. While German tanks struggled to advance along the roads of Donbass, softened by autumn rains, work was in full swing in the rear. Fortified areas were created on the approaches to Rostov-on-Don, along the Mius River, and near Taganrog. Thousands of civilians, women, old people, teenagers, dug anti-tank ditches, built pillboxes and bunkers, and installed anti-tank obstacles. Lieutenant General Dmitry Ryabyshev, commander of the Southern Front from November '41, noted in his memoirs, "Every day the Germans were delayed in Donbass was worth its weight in gold. We literally won the war by hours and minutes. In the 2 weeks that the enemy lost in battles for the mining towns, we managed to create a strong defense along the Mius River, which played a decisive role in thwarting the German offensive on Rostov." The slowdown in the Wehrmacht's offensive allowed the Soviet command to transfer reserves from other sectors of the front and from deep within the country. By the end of October, fresh divisions from Siberia and Central Asia arrived in the southern direction. These units, well-equipped and trained, played a key role in the subsequent defensive battles. Of particular importance was the time gained for the evacuation of people. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, primarily women, children, skilled workers, and engineers, were evacuated from the cities and towns of Donbass. These people escaped the horrors of occupation and soon stood at machines in new factories in the rear. The delay in the German offensive also had serious psychological consequences. For Soviet soldiers and officers, this was the first experience of successful resistance to the blitzkrieg. Not a victory, but not a defeat either. People saw that the Wehrmacht was not omnipotent, that it could be stopped, even at the cost of enormous sacrifices. For the German command, the slowdown in the offensive became the first alarming signal. The war, which was supposed to end before winter, threatened to drag on indefinitely. The Wehrmacht, designed for short, swift campaigns, was not ready for a protracted war of attrition. Chief of the General Staff of the German Army, Colonel General Franz Halder, wrote in his diary on November 1, '41, "The Russians are putting up desperate resistance. Particularly fierce fighting is taking place in Donbass. Our losses are growing. The pace of the offensive is falling. Time is working against us." The time gained in the battles for Donbass allowed the Soviet command to reorient its strategy of warfare. From attempts to stop the enemy along the entire front, they moved to creating powerful defense strongholds in key directions. A system of echeloned defense in depth began to form, allowing the enemy to be worn down even if the first line of fortifications was breached. Thus, the defense of Donbass, although it ended in a tactical defeat for the Soviet troops, had immense strategic significance. The time gained allowed for the preservation of industrial potential, the transfer of reserves, and the preparation of new defensive lines. It was here, in the mining region, that the blitzkrieg began to falter, and the war took on a protracted character for which Germany was not prepared. Behind every great battle stand ordinary people, soldiers, officers, civilians, whose fates intertwine with the course of history. The Donbass battle is no exception. In this meat grinder of autumn 1941, the best and worst sides of human nature were revealed, and personal heroism often became the decisive factor in seemingly hopeless situations. Sergeant Ivan Petrenko, a gun crew commander, was a miner at the Gorlovka mine before the war. When German tanks broke through to his native village, Petrenko took up a position on the terrace of a mine spoil tip. From here, his 45mm anti-tank gun controlled the only road leading to the mine. For 3 hours, Petrenko's crew held back the advance of the German column, knocking out 4 tanks and an armored personnel carrier. When the shells ran out, the wounded sergeant sent his men to the rear, while he himself stayed to cover their retreat. He was found 2 weeks after the village's liberation, wounded but alive, saved by local residents. Nurse Anna Sokolova, a 20-year-old student at the Donetsk Medical Institute, found herself at the epicenter of the battles for Stalino. In the basement of a ruined school, she organized a field hospital. Under continuous bombardments, by the light of kerosene lamps, Anna and 2 orderlies provided aid to the wounded. In 3 days, more than 150 people passed through their hands. When the Germans entered the city, Anna managed to evacuate the severely wounded through underground communications connecting the school to an abandoned mine. Later, she joined a partisan detachment and continued to save lives behind enemy lines. Not only military personnel became heroes of the Donbas Defense. Stepan Vasilyevich Lukyanov, director of the Makeyevka metallurgical plant, oversaw the evacuation of the enterprise until the last possible moment. Under his leadership, unique equipment from the rolling mill was dismantled and sent to the Urals. When German tanks were already entering the city, Lukyanov personally mined the blast furnace, refusing to leave the plant until the order to destroy what could not be evacuated was carried out. He died in the explosion, but his sacrifice was not in vain. The Germans never managed to restore the plant. Drama also unfolded in the sky over Donbass. Fighter pilot Lieutenant Alexei Maresyev, the future hero of Boris Polovoy's novel A Story About a Real Man, made his first combat sorties in those days. On October 20th, covering the retreat of ground forces, his flight of 3 Yak-1 fighters engaged 12 Messerschmitts. In an unequal battle, Maresyev shot down 2 German planes, but was himself shot down. With difficulty landing his burning aircraft, he managed to get out of the cockpit and reach his own forces, despite being wounded. The fate of the peaceful inhabitants of Donbass was tragic. Many did not manage or did not want to evacuate, remaining in their native homes. The family of miner Nikolai Kravchenko, from the village of Yuzovka, found themselves in occupied territory. When the Germans began to round up people for forced labor in Germany, Kravchenko organized an underground group that helped people hide in abandoned mines. More than 300 people were saved thanks to his efforts before a traitor exposed the underground fighters. Nikolai was captured by the Gestapo and subjected to brutal treatment, but did not betray his comrades. Railroad workers played a special role in the defense of Donbass. Engineer Pyotr Krivonos drove the last evacuation trains under continuous bombardments. When his train carrying equipment from the Lugansk locomotive plant was attacked by German planes and caught fire, Krivonos did not abandon the controls. With burnt hands and face, he brought the train to its destination station, saving invaluable cargo. After a short treatment, Pyotr returned to duty and continued to drive trains until the end of the war. In these difficult days, not only heroism but also humanity was displayed. Maria Petrovna Kovaleva, a teacher from Gorlovka, remaining in the occupied city, managed to preserve and hide the school library, more than 2,000 books that the Germans planned to destroy. Risking her life, she continued to secretly teach children, maintaining their faith in the future and preserving a piece of normal life amidst the chaos of war. The history of the Donbas Defense is a mosaic of thousands of such fates, each unique and significant in its own way. Behind the dry figures of losses and gains stand living people whose actions, often unnoticed in the scale of a great war, collectively determined its outcome. Their steadfastness, selflessness, and faith in victory became the foundation upon which the liberation of their native land was later built. The Donbas Defense became a harsh but necessary lesson for the Soviet military leadership. Every bloody battle, every inch of given up but dearly sold land, transformed into invaluable experience that subsequently formed the basis of a new strategy for confronting the German war machine. The main conclusion drawn by the Stavka of the Supreme High Command was simple yet revolutionary. The blitzkrieg could be stopped. The Wehrmacht, which had seemed invincible after lightning campaigns in Europe, for the first time faced a situation where its offensive momentum began to wane, and the pace of advance slowed to unacceptable levels for the strategy of lightning warfare. It was in the Donbass steppes that a new Soviet defensive doctrine was born. If previously the concept of a continuous front, where forces were evenly distributed along the entire defense line, dominated, now the emphasis shifted to creating fortified areas in key directions. A system of echeloned defense in depth appeared, allowing the enemy to be worn down even if the first line of fortifications was breached. Special attention began to be paid to anti-tank defense. The experience of battles in Donbass showed that even small groups of artillerymen, correctly positioned on the terrain and acting decisively, could inflict serious damage on enemy tank formations. Specialized anti-tank reserves appeared, which could be quickly moved to threatened areas. Commanders learned to create so-called fire sacks, areas where enemy tanks fell under crossfire from anti-tank artillery from masked positions. The most important conclusion was an understanding of the importance of the terrain and its engineering equipment. Mines, spoil heaps, ravines, and balkas of Donbass, when skillfully used, turned into impregnable fortresses. The Soviet command began to pay more attention to fortification, the creation of minefields, anti-tank ditches, escarps, and counter-escarps. The experience of the successful evacuation of Donbass industrial enterprises formed the basis of a new economic strategy. It became obvious that in modern warfare, industrial potential could not only be protected, but also moved. This concept of a mobile economy allowed the Soviet Union to restore military production in the shortest possible time, even after losing significant territories. The tactics of Air Force application were also rethought. If at the beginning of the war, Soviet pilots acted according to outdated pre-war instructions, after the battles over Donbass, a transition began to more flexible combat formations. Instead of dense wedge and echelon formations, pairs and flights began to be used, providing better maneuverability and mutual support. special attention was paid to the interaction of different branches of service. Experience showed that isolated actions of infantry, tanks, or artillery were ineffective against a well-organized enemy. Only their close interaction yielded results. The concept of combined arms combat began to form, which subsequently became the basis of Soviet military doctrine. The lessons of the Donbas Defense were also reflected in the training of command personnel. In military schools and officer advanced training courses, more attention began to be paid to tactics of combating enemy tank wedges, organizing defense in urban conditions, and conducting mobile defense. The experience of successful commanders who managed to organize effective resistance to superior enemy forces was studied. The psychological training of troops also changed significantly. If at the beginning of the war, many commanders and political workers avoided talking about a possible retreat, fearing demoralization of personnel, now the emphasis was on an organized withdrawal with maximum damage to the enemy. Soldiers were taught not to panic at the sight of German tanks, but to act calmly, using the features of the terrain and available anti-tank weapons. An important lesson was an understanding of the role of the local population in defense. The experience of Donbass showed that miners, metallurgists, and railway workers could become not only a source of replenishment for regular units, but also an independent fighting force. People's militia, extermination battalions, and partisan detachments became an integral part of the Soviet defensive strategy. The concept of time in modern warfare was also rethought. The Soviet command realized that in the conditions of total war of motorized armies, even a few days' delay in the enemy's offensive could have strategic significance. Every day gained provided an opportunity to evacuate industry, bring up reserves, and strengthen defensive lines. The lessons of the Donbas Defense found practical application already in the battles for Rostov in November 1941. Here, Soviet troops for the first time applied a new tactic of echeloned defense, creating several lines with intermediate positions. The German offensive bogged down, and the subsequent counterattack led to the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht since the beginning of the war. Even more fully, these lessons were implemented in the Battle of Stalingrad, where the principles of deeply echeloned defense, anti-tank strongholds, and maneuverable use of reserves led to the encirclement and destruction of a large enemy grouping. The Donbas Defense became a turning point in the evolution of Soviet military art. Here, in the mining region, among spoil heaps and ruined factories, a new strategy was born, which ultimately led to victory in the most terrible war in human history. The price of these lessons was incredibly high. Tens of thousands dead, hundreds of destroyed cities and towns, millions of crippled destinies. But these sacrifices were not in vain. They became the foundation of future victory, the basis on which a new generation of commanders and soldiers grew, who managed to turn the tide of the war and reach Berlin. The historical significance of the Donbas Defense in 1941 extends far beyond a local battle on the southern flank of the Soviet-German front. In the context of the entire Great Patriotic War, this confrontation became a turning point when the hitherto invincible blitzkrieg began to experience its first serious setbacks. Here, among the slag heaps and ruined factories, the understanding was born. The German war machine could be stopped. At the cost of incredible effort, at the cost of thousands of lives, but it could. The Donbas Defense did not just slow down the enemy's advance. It changed the very nature of the war. If, until the autumn of '41, the Wehrmacht dictated the pace and direction of military operations, now the initiative began to gradually shift to the Soviet command. German generals for the first time faced a situation where the offensive schedule was disrupted, and losses exceeded all projected figures. The strategic importance of the Donbas Defense manifested itself in several key aspects. Firstly, it thwarted the German command's plans for a rapid capture of the southern industrial regions of the USSR. Hitler's headquarters expected to seize Donbass in 2 to 3 weeks, and then make a swift dash to Rostov-on-Don and further to the Caucasus. Instead, the Wehrmacht got bogged down in heavy, exhausting battles that stretched for months. When German tanks finally reached Rostov in November 41, they no longer possessed the offensive potential that would have allowed them to develop their success. Secondly, the delay in the German offensive allowed the Soviet command to gain precious time for the evacuation of industry. More than 60% of Donbass's production capacities were successfully dismantled and sent to the Urals in Siberia. These factories soon began producing for the front, making an invaluable contribution to the creation of military-industrial potential in the deep rear. Each day of the Donbas Defense turned into weeks of work for the evacuated enterprises. Thirdly, the Donbas Defense became the first serious test for the blitzkrieg strategy on the Eastern Front. For the first time, the German command faced a situation where classic tank wedges began to lose effectiveness. Stretched communications, supply problems, increased losses in equipment and manpower, all this forced the Wehrmacht to revise its operational plans. The war acquired a protracted character, for which Germany was not ready either economically or psychologically. Fourthly, the experience of battles in Donbass formed the basis of a new Soviet defensive doctrine. It was here that the concept of echeloned defense, anti-tank strongholds, and maneuverable use of reserves was born. These principles were subsequently successfully applied in the Battle of Stalingrad and other key battles. The Soviet command drew invaluable lessons from every battle, every lost and recaptured position. Finally, the Donbas Defense had enormous moral and psychological significance. For Soviet soldiers and officers, this was the first experience of successful resistance to the blitzkrieg. Perhaps not a victory, but not a rout either. People saw that the Wehrmacht was not omnipotent, that it could be stopped, even at the cost of enormous sacrifices. This psychological turning point is difficult to overestimate. It became the foundation of future victories. For the German army, the battles for Donbass became the first harbinger of future defeats. Wehrmacht soldiers and officers, accustomed to easy victories in Europe, for the first time encountered fierce resistance that could not be broken by either numerical superiority or technical advantage. This gave rise to the first doubts about the invincibility of the German war machine. The Donbas Defense clearly demonstrated another crucial factor: the role of the civilian population in modern warfare. Miners and metallurgists who became militiamen, women and teenagers who helped the wounded and extinguished fires, workers who dismantled factories under bombing, all of them were full participants in the battle. The war truly became a people's war, and this determined its outcome. In a historical context, the Donbas Defense occupies a special place between the first catastrophic defeats of the summer of '41 and the pivotal victories of '42 and '43. This was a time when the aggressor was still advancing, but no longer so rapidly, when the defenders were still retreating, but no longer in disarray. It was an inflection point, the moment when the pendulum of war began its movement in the opposite direction. The price of this turning point was incredibly high. Tens of thousands killed, hundreds of ruined cities and towns, millions of crippled destinies. Donbass paid a terrible price to become an obstacle to the blitzkrieg. But these sacrifices were not in vain. They became the foundation of future victory, the basis on which a new generation of commanders and soldiers grew, who were able to turn the tide of the war and reach Berlin. Today, looking back at the events of 80 years ago, we can confidently say the Donbas Defense of 1941 became one of the key battles that changed the course not only of the Great Patriotic War, but of the entire Second World War. Here, in the mining region, among the slag heaps and factory chimneys, the foundation of a strategy was laid that ultimately led to victory in the most terrible war in human history.